Hey everyone, I'm Mike Tauber, and today we're going to learn about design and composition for making a better painting. So this is a piece that I did, and I'm going to show you how to use design and composition to make an even better layout so you will have better results with your paintings. So let's start with the materials. Very simple materials. We're going to start with basically just some drawing paper. This is just 8.5 by 11 drawing paper. We're also going to be using tracing paper. Tracing paper comes in sheets or in rolls, and this is like a clear parchment type of paper. It's kind of see-through. We also have transfer paper, which is graphite coated paper, and it comes in rolls or sheets, and it has a light side and then it has graphite on the dark side. As well, we're going to be using some regular pencils and an eraser. And I've got some chalk pastels here, a black, a gray, and a light gray. You're going to want a blending stick. You could use, I use old paintbrushes because I like the way they feel. But you can also use a Q-tip, a blending stick, or even sometimes your finger. And then we also have painter's tape. This is very easy to remove. When you stick things down, you could peel it back up. So I like to use painter's tape. So those are your materials. Okay, so let's get started talking about the differences between these two designs. And this you're going to see, it's the subject matter is a koi fish and lily pads, and it's on a kind of in a pond, a dark watery pond, and there's also a shadow on the ground. So I really want you to look at all these elements, and I'm going to talk about this painting first. So I'm going to set these down here, and let's look at the differences between these two paintings. So let's look at this piece, and the first thing I want to talk about is eye travel. So we tend to look at things from left to right when we're looking at paintings, or the way we read. It's just the way our eyes go. We look from left to right. And so this piece, although I like that the fish is swimming to the left, your eye tends to look over. It tends to read from left to right, and which is nice that this fish is swimming back into the scene, so he's pulling you back around. What I really don't know if I like about this painting is that there's a little bit of a tight space right here where the fish almost looks like it's hitting into the edge of the painting, and there's a lot of loose negative space right over here. And so it's really giving a lot of emphasis on this tail, and the head really is a little bit pushed in down here. Also, I think the piece feels like it's a little bottom heavy. So you're going to see the difference that I made in this new drawing that we're going to be working on today. And in this one, I have 2 koi fish and I have 4 lily pads. So what we're going to see here is the shape of this painting. Notice that the fish are going from left to right here, and we have the shadow is coming down and creating a shadow on the ground that you're going to probably want to see in your painting. What I like about this painting is the fact that it looks like the koi fish is floating. You could see that there's a ground, which is the bottom of the pond, and he looks like he's swimming through the pond. So we gave him the look of floating rather than being seated on the ground. And as well, the lily pads are casting shadows on the floor beneath them. So that's what's called a light source and a shadow. So let's start with our eye travel for this piece. And I call this eye travel because it's where does your eye go when it's looking at this painting, at this piece. So I'm going to put this piece right here, the finished work, and we're going to talk about the eye travel. So I'm going to use a red pencil here just so you can see it real clearly about where your eye goes when you're looking at this painting. And one of the more interesting things I think is that when we read a painting, our things tend to fall to the right. I don't like it when things fall off the right or bottom edge of the painting. So you'll see in a lot of the pieces that I like to do is I like to do a swing, a type of line that pulls your eye. So instead of falling off the lower right, it draws you back into the painting. I like circular designs. And so you're going to see this piece actually has a little hidden circle in it. So your eye tends to go from the face of this fish up through these lily pads over here, and look at that nice round curve right back into that fish, and then this one pulls you right back down, and so it creates this round beautiful effect here. These 2 lily pads I think kind of add an anchor at the bottom that keeps your eye up there centered on your painting. Instead of falling off or going off the borders, you want to keep your viewer's eye attracted into your painting and keep looking at all the elements. So this red line I'm going to draw is going to show you that your eye goes this way, right up to there, and it follows along. And that's what I like about this painting. Kind of a hypnotic effect where your eye keeps traveling in there. So that's what we talk about eye travel. As well, because we read from left to right, you may want to put your fish traveling to the left. And the reason being because your eye goes this way, but the fish is going that way. So it's another way to keep your viewer's eye trained on your painting. In the example we have, I happen to have him facing to the right, but it's because he's pointing back up, and the circle does still keep you back in the painting. But keep eye travel in mind when you're positioning. This could be any kind of animal, like a bird or a insect. Which direction are they heading? You don't want them heading towards the bottom or the lower right. I often like them heading towards the left or back into the painting. So that's our eye travel. Let's talk about shapes. So the shapes, and I use these photographs to influence my design. So these are the lily pads, and the shape of a lily pad is basically a circle or an oval, and it has like a little split line to it. And so you want to always look at photographs when you're doing your designs. So the shapes of a lily pad, this is a perfectly round circle, but it looks a little bit more interesting if you do what's an oval shape, because this one looks more like it's sitting flat on the surface of the water, whereas a circle looks like you're looking straight down. So you'll see on our design that we're working on, I made them more of an oval shape and not so much of a circle. Let's talk about perspective. Perspective is pretty important, and perspective, things get smaller as they go further into the distance. So if you had a larger painting or more lily pads and you wanted the feeling of a pond going further back, you're looking at the surface, the travel of perspective, the lines get narrower and smaller as they go into the background. So look at this very small, and you could kind of get a feeling like there's a long depth of field there. So larger, bigger objects are in the foreground. This is generally speaking. Then medium in the middle, smaller and smaller. So that's something you want to keep in mind is perspective. We're going to see there's a little bit of that in this painting. You'll see the bigger objects are here in the foreground, and I do have the smaller lily pads there. They're a little bit smaller, but they give a sense that there's some distance on top of this painting, the pond. Okay, so let's talk about line shapes. Line shapes are important, and sometimes it's good just to practice them to loosen up your hands when you're getting ready to start your drawing. So we've got the smile line. We have a frown line. You're going to hear me talk about these shapes all the time. We have the letter C. We have a backwards letter C. We also like to use the letter J or backwards letter J's. So these are interesting shapes that I like to think of in my head while I'm working on designs. Let's talk about light source. Light source, I use one that's called an 11 o'clock light source. So instead of 12 o'clock, which is straight overhead, it would create a shadow directly beneath it. I use what's called an 11 o'clock light source. So notice that in my drawing here, the light source is, if you're looking at a clock, it would be at the 11 o'clock position. And it creates a straight line down onto your image. So if it's 11 o'clock, it pushes that shadow exactly opposite of where your sunlight is. So if you look at that's my little image of my son, and you could see that it's replicating the shape, but it's just creating a shadow. And that's telling you that there's a ground surface there, or it's locating the piece above the ground. So this top image, you're going to see a little bit of a difference between the two. This is more of a floating image, and this one is a seated image. So your shadow is going to tell your viewer how high up in the water is that fish. The higher it is, the smaller and further away that shadow is. And if it gets closer, the shadow gets bigger and closer to the fish. So this fish looks like it's sitting on the ground. This fish looks like it's hovering through the water. So you definitely want to keep light source in mind. And you're going to notice in our drawing that you could see the fish look like they're hovering through the water, and that shadow's telling you that they're off the ground. Okay, so we're ready to get started on our design. And so we're going to start with drawing our koi fish. Okay, so let's start looking at these fish images I've got here. Basically, koi fish are kind of shaped like little torpedoes. Not too much complication in the shape. I like to take photographs and scribble all over them all the time. And sometimes it's a great way to practice. So I'm taking my red line here, and do you see how I'm just getting that little long teardrop shape and just a little tail? Practice a few of that off to the side. And you're gonna see that they have a little bit of a vacuum cleaner type of mouth. And it has pectoral fins, dorsal fins, and then this long fin along its back. So take a look at a few different koi fish, and they all have that long torpedo shape. And let's look at the shadow while we're looking. This one looks like he's sitting flat on the ground. See how close that shadow is? There's no space between the fish and the shadow, so it looks like he's parked on the ground floor. Let's look at the shadow of this one, and see how this upper fish, the shadow is a little bit away from the fish. That shows that he's swimming or floating, which I think is a little bit more interesting. So this is the fish that I was looking at for our drawing. So let's start drawing him right now. Let's start by grabbing your pencil, and what we're gonna do, I'm gonna try to draw this a little bit darker than you should be drawing, but I want you to draw just a long line, which is somewhat of a smile line, and there's a little bit of a frown at the end. Then what we could do is we're gonna create the thickness of the body. So this is basically what we're starting with, is this long spinal cord like that. That's what we're starting with. So now above that, we're gonna add the thickness of the fish. There's where his head is gonna be. And then let's come down here and draw the thickness of his body. The tail is just a little frown line at the end, and you could do another frown line at that end. And that's the basic shape of our fish. Let's put our little eyeball right about there. And now we're gonna look at the head is about 1/4 of where his body is. So we're gonna do a little bit of a backward C there, and then the gills are a letter C right there. Let's draw in. Our pectoral fin is basically the letter V. There's another one on the other side. Go right across the body, and it's much smaller. Just a little bit of it is visible on the top edge. You can see it in this piece right here. There's his pectoral fin, and there's that dorsal fin. And see that there's a much smaller pectoral fin on that side. Okay, so then we have like a little bit of a notch shape in there, in that back fin there. And then we're going to locate his, the top fin, right along the top there. And once we like that, you know, you might have to work out your sketches over here. Remember how we talked about our letter shape, so I'm gonna do a letter J. And that gives you those lips, that little vacuum cleaner mouth right there that the koi fish have. Okay, so now you might want to fatten your fish. Do any correcting at this point. I like the shape of some of these fins. See how this one has a little bit of, there's some notches in the back of his fin, so you might want to add a few notches right there at this point. Thin it out a little bit here. Make any kind of corrections that you like while you're looking at that fish. Okay, so once we got that worked out, we're going to use this tracing paper. You can also use your darker pencil line to really make sure that you like it. I also like that there's a little bit of a bump where his eye is on that side. Once you're really sure you like everything, draw it in much darker this time. Okay, so now what we're going to do is grab our tracing paper and we're going to do a tracing of that. So this is a clear tracing paper. You're going to take a little bit of your blue tape. We're going to place it right on top of that fish. And what this is going to do is going to give us something that we could work with when we're laying out our painting on the canvas. So now I'm just going to do a single nice clean drawing, and it's going to be perfect because we did all that rough sketching on our drawing paper, and now I'm getting the beautiful finished fish, and I won't have as many mistakes to correct. Let's draw his little head in there and then his gill. There we go. Oh, we forgot to put in this dorsal fin, which is right about there. Again, it's just like the letter J back there, and it looks like it's coming underneath his body. So now you could see that there's our koi fish. You could add a little bit more detail to his lips if you want. And so this is going to be our tool for when we move on to our actual drawing. So we're going to do the same thing with our lily pads, the same way. So I made a whole bunch of these lily pads by tracing them with my tracing paper. Because I'm going to use these as tools. It's kind of like using collage as you're designing your painting. On my lily pads, remember in our painting we talked about perspective, and so I drew myself 3 lily pads here on this piece of practice paper until I got it right, and I really liked them a lot. Then you're going to take your dark pencil and perfect them. Then once you have 3 that you really like, and I was basing them on the size of this fish. That's why I wanted sizes of lily pads that would look good with my fish. And of course, I was also looking at my drawing for my lily pads. So I took my tracing paper and I traced all of my drawings. I made a simple, clean line drawing, and I actually made several of them so I could use them for my collage. So there's a large, there's a medium, there's a small. Okay, so now we're ready to go with our final composition. We drew our fish on the rough drawing paper. We did a nice clean drawing on the tracing paper. We drew our lily pads, and then we made several of them using our nice tracing paper. So let's look at our composition. So here's the fish. If you notice, I'm going to have 2 fish. The good news is about having this is that you could use it again and again, and you can also turn it over if you want your fish to go in the other direction. You can, oh, I forgot to tell you, I did a black outline around my actual painting here so you could just see where my border is. This other piece I'm using as a stiff backing sheet. So what the great news is about by having this is you can move things around. You could put 2 lily pads there and your fish down below. You could have him swimming through the lily pads. You could flip the lily pads over there or there. You could put 3 or 4 of them. This is really a great way to get a lot of mileage out of your drawing and make sure that your painting is perfect, the composition, before you get started on that painting. So let's work out all those design issues right now. So my fish is right here, and you could see I took the piece and I liked that smiling line, and remember that I didn't want it tipping over here. Look at how bad that looks, pushing into the lower right corner. That's not good. And why do you have all this negative space up here? So maybe you want to draw your fish coming into the painting. That's a little bit more interesting. Is he pointing down too far and drawing your eye down to the bottom? Is it in a weird position going up? That looks pretty awkward. So what you're going to be doing is moving this around and putting it around on your page to a place that's pleasing to the eye and interesting. So what I did is I found my composition that was really pleasing was to go like this. Once you get it in position, remember we're going to put our lily pads in there also. You could play with them around. I know that I'm going to want to put a few here and a couple in this negative space up here. We know that I'm going to be doing that. So what you want to do is create a hinge with your tape, and then we're going to put down our tracing paper and we're going to trace it on. You use your carbon paper, graphite side down, for your tracing. And then what you're going to do is just inch along the outside of your tracing. We're just going to create a simple line drawing. Be sure to get in the eyeballs, dorsal fins, what I'm doing right now is pressing down, and if you look, it's transferring the drawing right onto my finished drawing paper. So look, I got my whole fish down, and then we're going to do that with all of our lily pads also. I put a second fish in there, so the good news is you can use the same drawing to create 2 fish or 3 fish, which is really efficient for getting your drawing done. You know, you could also, what's nice about the tracing paper, transparent, so I could see, oh my gosh, do I want that behind the fish or not? So see how his fin is slightly behind his tail right there? I did not do that there, but maybe I'll do it here. It looks a little bit more interesting. So you're going to tape it down. Use your carbon paper and very lightly go over the outline of that fish. Check your work before you take it off. Everything's on there, so there I've got my 2 fish right there. Okay, so now I'm going to put down my lily pads. You're doing the same technique. They have that little split area in them. I kind of liked this one. I flipped it over. I thought that looked a little bit more interesting, facing out that way. And we could tape down all of our lily pads right now if you want. I have a large and a medium right here. There we go. Tape them down once you get it in a pleasing area, and you can move them around as much as you want. And then I've got some transferred really nicely. Let's do the same thing up here. Be careful when you're using your carbon paper that the dark side is facing down. You want to push that carbon down into your drawing. If you want to check, sometimes it's good to pick it up and take a peek. Is that transferring? Make sure you got it right. They look great. Okay, so now remember our light source. We talked about shadow. I like 11 o'clock shadow, which means if there's a light coming, not center, which is 12, 11 o'clock is there, it's going to cast a shadow a little bit to the right below the objects. So let's go back and use this great fish template again. And the shadow, remember, it replicates the object that the light is being cast on. So remember, if I put my shadow too close under the fish, it's going to look like it's flat sitting on the floor of the pond, but I want to make it look more like it's floating. So do you see how I have a little bit of a gap between the shadow and the actual object? So it looks like it's floating. So what I'm going to do is just take my shape and replicate it down there. And then we're going to trace very lightly. And this is going to tell us where our shadow is going. The shadows are a little bit more generic. You don't have to be as specific with them. Okay, so I'm going to darken that shadow line a little bit. So do you see there's the fish and there's the shadow line I just created. Let's do it again up here. I'm just going to remind myself that that's a shadow by doing a little bit of sketching on top. Okay, these 2 lily pads, these guys don't need a shadow. I'm just going to make this whole bottom area of my painting very dark. But these lily pads need some shadows too. So you're going to get the same size lily pad. I had a medium there and a small. There they are right there. And I'm going to actually just move it a little bit down and to the right. It's because my light source is 11 o'clock and it's casting the shadow on the floor right about there. So just redraw your lily pads. Graphite paper. There they are. All right, so sometimes you want to go back over just to clean up your lines a little bit. And this lily pad, you could use your eraser if that bothers you, because when you're tracing, it's gonna overlap onto some things that you didn't want it to. So you can erase that if you want to. Usually I'm not too worried about that. So here's my shadow. Okay, so we got our lily pads and shadows, our two fish and our shadows, and then these two bottom lily pads. So we're ready to go. So I'm gonna start with my soft pastels. I'm liking everything. At this point, if you're satisfied, you could keep it. If you wanted to, say you wanted to add a third lily pad, now's the chance to do it. You wanna work out all the issues here before you go to your painting. So I think it'd be neat to have like one more going off the page up here, kind of going outside the edge of the painting. So I'm adding another one. And that's what's so great about these little tracing paper sketches. Look at how great, now I created a little bit more of a composition up there. Don't forget, you're gonna have to put your shadow in. It's a little bit lower and to the right, so all the shadows are consistent. There it is, so that's gonna have that dark shadow right under there. Okay, so let's define our lines. So I'm gonna use a little bit of a heavier pencil. And now when you get to a point like this, you've got to remind yourself that what's overlapping what. So sometimes you might want to erase that, but also be mindful not to make a mistake. So now I'm going to do a nice hard drawn outline of all my shapes. Those are those little whiskers that the koi fish have. There's his gill, a little softer on that. That fin is hidden under that lily pad. Okay, I'm getting a little bit more loose now with my pencil lines. I got two lily pads done. I have that fish. See how that fish his fin is underneath there, so you might want to take your eraser and erase that area of overlap. Let's draw in his little eye, his gill. Remember the vacuum cleaner mouth. And there's his top fin. I want to indicate a little bit of an eye. Let's finish our three lily pads right up here. There's one. There's number two. And there's number three. Okay, so we've got all our drawings down. And then remember, I've got my 3 shades of chalk pastels. This is going to be the dark shadow. This is going to be our background, and then we're going to use this as an accent on our fish. So you're going to take your darkest pastel, and let's start with our shadows first. So let's just start blocking this in. This is going to get us ready for our painting, because we're going to want to know where the darkest tones are. So I'm going to start blocking some of that in. You can use your pencil for this if you have to, but the chalk just speeds it along. I just noticed I forgot to outline that fin over there. There you go. So now I'm blocking in just my shadow, and then I'm going to blend it in. So this is where you can use your blending brush. What I'm doing is creating this nice deep dark shadow area here. That's underneath that fish. Let's add a little bit more of that chalk onto our paper. Again, you could be using a Q-tip or a blending stick, or sometimes your finger even, and really rubs it in. Okay, so when you're painting in your shadows, be mindful of that this is the floor of the pond. And so I'm using, if there is going to be any brush strokes, you want to use a horizontal brush stroke. So not all kinds of wiggly lines. You want to create the look that there's a flat floor. So remember, this is just a study to work out all these issues before you actually start your painting. So this is called a value study. And it helps you identify what areas of the painting are going to be the darkest and which ones are going to be the lightest. A lot of artists do value studies because this is a great place to work out a lot of the design issues, because once you get on the canvas and with your paint, you want to make sure that everything's perfect, and then you can really concentrate on your brush strokes and on your color. All right, so that's dark number 1. Now I'm going to be moving to this medium gray, and then later I have the light gray. So the rest of the background I'm going to use for the medium gray pastel. So again, you want to kind of keep your strokes horizontal. So don't be tempted to color that in like that, because it starts to look like an object. So what we're going to do is fill in this whole background with this beautiful soft gray, a medium value, I'm going to use my blending stick. In my case, I like to use an old scrappy paintbrush to blend in. And again, I'm trying to keep a long horizontal stroke here. Oops, I accidentally went over the fin of that fish. We could pull that back off. So I want you to note that the lines of the shadows are a little bit softer and more blurred than the outlines of the objects. So you notice that we definitely want to keep a hard, distinct line at the edge of our lily pads. We want a hard outline where the fish are, but where these shadows are, they could be a little bit softer or blurry. We don't want the shadows to read like an object. We just want them to read like a soft secondary design element. So see how I'm kind of blending a little bit of that in? Okay, your chalk pastels can be a little bit dusty at times, so sometimes you need to pick up your painting and just blow away some of that dust. Okay, there's our background all blocked in. So we've got the background of the pond and the shadows, and then we have our objects right here. When we're looking at our lily pads, if you look at the photograph, these kind of have radiating lines into the design. And so it's not immediately obvious, but it's a very subtle thing there. So we want to, I liked that radiating design, and it showed a difference between the lily pads, the background, and the fish. So I'm just going to go back in with my pencil. And there was like a little center spine right here. And as you're going, we're going to do these radiating design around each of our lily pads. First you're going to do is block in your designs. It's kind of like bicycle spokes. Your center spine and your bicycle spokes all going towards the center. All right, so now we're going to do some soft rendering of those lily pads. And I want some long and some short, and leave some negative space in between. So this is helping us tell the characteristic of that object, which in this case is the lily pad. And you're going to want to keep this in mind when you're doing your painting, because the shape and direction of the brush strokes are also important. So whenever you're rendering or designing, you're also working on the design and the composition and the texture. So this is creating that nice drawing line. You could also take your finger or a Q-tip and kind of soften those lines. And this tells the viewer the shape of those lily pads and that they have these radiating lines. We could take a little bit of our medium tone chalk pastel and bring a little bit of that into the top of the lily pads for some variation. See, with my brush, I'm keeping those radiating lines going. Okay, now we've got our 5 lily pads, You could keep strengthening some of those lines if you want. Now I'm going to show a little bit of thickness on the lily pads. So I'm drawing in the edge, and this is just along the bottom edge that's facing me. So as you're looking at these lily pads, you're sort of seeing a little bit of that edge, and I like to show a little bit of thickness. So we're just going to do a secondary line. These are big smile lines, just along the bottom edge of the lily pads, and it seems to give them a little bit of weight at the bottom. All right, so let's start on our fish now. Again, our light source is coming from the top left. So we're going to use our lightest color pastel. And remember, if we're looking at the fish, if you look at this yellow fish here, do you see how the light source is hitting from the top? The shadow is falling here, and this side of the fish's body is also shadowed. So what we're going to do is do the same thing on our sketch. We want the light to be hitting from the top left, therefore the shadow is on the bottom right. So what we're going to do is take our lightest chalk pastel, and remember, we want to keep a little bit of a white edge along the bottom of the fish, and it gives it a sense of reflection, because the fish are kind of glossy and shiny. So don't bring it all the way down to the bottom of the fish. And let's get some on his face. And this one. So now we're starting to model the fish, and what you're seeing is the light is hitting this side of the fish. This is the dark. And we've created, remember, there's that center spine along the top of the fish. I think this is a good example to look at. See how the light is just hitting the top half of that fish? There's like a spine along the top center, and this whole side is in the dark shadow. So there's that spinal cord line right along the top. So let's keep that in mind when you're putting in the shadow tones of your fish. And then if you want to add a few of the spots or splotches onto your fish, you can use the medium dark gray. Try not to be too much like polka dots. I like to think of shapes of continents or states when I'm doing these, like Africa, or there's Pennsylvania, or Italy, or something like that. Let's use our darker pencil and darken those in. A little bit of detail on the fins. Okay, so now we have our finished rendering. We've worked out all the design and compositional issues. We like where our shadows are going, and this is going to be it. We're going to do the same process on your canvas board, the same thing that we did here with the transfer paper and tracing. Work them out on your canvas, and that's going to help you have a much more successful finished painting. So good luck on your future projects. Thanks so much for watching.